In this video, we're going to do step 2 of the authentication process, and that entails doing account creation. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll create a new controller in this project, and this will be our account controller. So add new controller, we'll do an empty controller, and we'll call it our account controller. I'm going to go ahead and delete the index action, and I'm going to replace it with a create action. Now this action will actually have a get and a set, so we'll do 2. And the second action will handle our post back, and this will need a user view model. I'm going to go ahead and add the attribute for HTTP post as well. Now inside of the get, and I'll go ahead and state that explicitly, I'm just going to return view. There won't be any work here. And then here I'll also just return view, but I'm going to add a comment above that says to capture user view model and convert to user DTO, or data transfer object. And I'll also add another comment where I need to save the user, and then I'm going to redirect to login. So that will be our process. Now we need to address this user view model. So we'll go back to models. I'm going to add another folder here and call it view models. Now the setting up of these folders like data and view models, they are not required. They are not part of the convention that MVC follows, but it's my personal preference to include those just to keep my data models versus my view models, and then any other models that I have, like my business models, essentially, to keep them kind of separated. And in later lectures, we'll actually go through and talk in even greater detail about how to keep models separated into different class library projects and things of that sort. So we'll right-click on View Models, choose Add, and we're going to add a class. Now I copied the name out of here, so I'll just paste that in there as User View Model, and hit Add. Now our user view model will be very similar to our user model. So I'm going to go ahead and start by just copying all of these properties out. And that saves me from some typing. Now the one property I do want to add is I'm going to use the double password entry verification. So password will actually be required twice. I'll do password and confirm password. So I'm going to add another property here called confirm password. And this confirm password will literally just be the password again as a string. So we'll go ahead and save that. And then we'll bring in our using statement for our view model. And so now we've established our controller and set up our model. So let's go ahead and we'll right click on create, and we're going to add a view here. And I'm going to use these templates. I'm going to use the create template. And I'm going to set the model class as my user view model. And I'll leave everything else the same. We're not explicitly going to use the DB context. We're going to kind of work that into our code. So we'll go through and say create. We're not going to create a partial. We'll leave our reference and our layout, and we'll just hit add. And what that'll do for us is that Visual Studio will actually go through and set up our model. Before we go and modify this model, I want to go ahead and just do a quick run and see how everything looks. Now I attempted to run my project, and what I ran into is that I'm getting a compilation error, and we've experienced this error before. To solve this problem, we've actually had to go through and make sure that we update NuGet on our solution. So right clicking the solution, I'm going to choose enable NuGet package restore first of all and hit yes, and that will just help NuGet to go out and bring down packages automatically from NuGet. So we'll right click on our solution, manage NuGet packages for solution. And the issue is that the version of NuGet that's installed gets out of sync with what's in Visual Studio. So we'll go ahead and do an update, and we'll see here that we're downloading a whole bunch of NuGet package updates. So once these updates have all installed, that will correct our runtime issue. Go ahead and hit close, and then if we right click and build, and then we jump back to our app and simply refresh, my mistake. I forgot to actually run. F5 to run. And now the view that we have, this is that stock view that came out of our template use from within Visual Studio. So we can go through and we can clean this up a little bit. So the first modification I'd like to make is I want to find my my editor or text box for the password field. I'd like to move that down. So this chunk here of HTML is the section I want to use. So I'm going to cut that, and then I'm going to move it down here with the password confirm. So once I've done that, that'll put us in a better spot. And now I want to change this editor for on the password property, and I want to actually use password for. And you'll notice here my IntelliSense doesn't really come up with exactly what I'm looking for. That happens occasionally where Visual Studio will get confused in the HTML view. The fix for that is actually to delete the dot. So it'll just be HTML, then you type dot, and then Control Tab. Oh, you know what? I am in run, so let me stop first. There we go. I'll hit the dot. And we want password for is the control type we want, and then we'll want password for here as well. So let's take care of that. And the password for basically will give us a text box with stars versus giving us a text box that's clear or open text. So we'll make those changes, hit save, and I'm actually going to go ahead and do a debug, and I'm going to run or start without debugging. And what that'll do is that'll spin up IIS Express, and that'll allow us to kind of go back and forth between our code and our views. So we'll see here, username, first name, last name, email, and then password and password confirm are now showing with dots. So that's definitely good progress. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this user view model piece from our view. So that's up here near the top. It's in this H4 tag. So we'll delete that and get it out of the way. F5 to, so let's just reload the page. There we go. And then this back to list doesn't really make sense in the context of this is creating a new user. So we'll find the back to list link down here at the bottom, and we'll just remove those. Last thing here is I want to change create to say create account. So we'll save that and refresh. So now we have a form that says create account. Username, first name, last name, email, and password with password confirm. So now we have a good view. The only thing that's left for us to do is to actually set up the post piece of our application. So we'll close our view, head back to our controller, and then we just need to do this step of actually capturing and creating the user. One thing we'll need to do up here is validate and do the password. So the first step I'll say is if user.password equals null, or user.password equals an empty string, then we're going to say this dot model state dot add model error, and that will be the error message with no key, and then the message, which is one of our overloads that takes a string, will say password is required. And then we can also do this again for the confirm password, but we'll change up how we check. We're going to say if, and then there's a static method off of the string class that's called is null or white space. And then we'll pass in user.password or confirm password. And this one function does the equivalent of these two lines, and it actually does an even better job. I actually prefer to use the is null or white space because it also checks for empty strings that may not be blank, but those strings may just have white space, space bar space, that kind of thing. So it'll actually account for that better than just looking for an empty string. So if that's the case, we'll say this dot model state dot add error add model error, and we'll say confirm password required. And the final validation will simply be if user.password does not equal user.confirm password, then we'll say this.model state dot add model error password mismatch. We'll say password and confirm password do not match. It's a little clearer. In all three of these cases, the one thing that we need to do as well is we need to return view with the view model being passed. And that's so that when we come back, we'll actually go back to the same view, and that view will still persist or contain the data that was entered into the model originally. So it'll actually bind the data that was submitted back to the page. Alright, so assuming that all three of those validations are in good shape, we don't have to worry about anything else, we can now go into the step of actually establishing our DB context and moving forward. So the first thing I'm going to do is use a using statement here. And the using statement allows us to utilize something that implements the iDisposable method. And items that implement iDisposable typically use a lot of resources like memory or network resources. And using the iDispose element allows you to release those managed resources quickly and efficiently. So we'll use our Model 8 DB context. We'll just call it our context. We'll create a new instance of that. And then we'll say that in our context, actually before that, that'll be the save step. Before that, we actually need to create our user data transfer object. So user DTO equals new user. Bring in that using statement. And we'll use our curly bracket inline initialization. So we'll say the email equals user.email. First name equals user.firstname. Skip the ID, user.lastname. And password is user.password. And username is user.username. Alright, so we've now created our user object. We'll use our context, context.users.add, and then we'll add our user DTO to the context, and then we'll say context.saveChanges. So once we've done that save changes, everything is in good shape. And then the last step here will be to return a redirect to action. And that action we will call login. Now we don't currently have a login action, so I'm going to go ahead and just stub out one called login. And for now we're just going to return some content. We'll just say logged in or login. And that'll just be our placeholder. So we'll hit F5 to build, and we are currently running without debugging, so we'll come back, we'll refresh. And then what I like to do is, let's actually go ahead and we're going to attach our debugger. Now to do that, you have a few options. Because we're already running without debug, we can still debug. We can go up to Tools, we can come down to, oh, I'm sorry, it's under, no, it's Tools. There it is. Attach to process. So I always just do Control-Alt-P, so sometimes I forget where they move it to on the menu. So attach to process. This will list every process currently running on your computer. So I have a lot of different processes, a lot of different programs running. The one of interest, if you don't see it, is you want to look for IIS Express, or if you're using a full version of IIS, you want to look for one that's called W3WP, which I currently don't have running. So IIS Express is the process. And this step is what Visual Studio automatically does when you run with debug. So we're just going through and doing this step manually. If for some reason you don't see it, make sure you check processes from all users, and then you might even have to use that refresh button. So we'll select IIS Express and hit attach, and then Visual Studio basically jumps into debug mode. So I can go ahead and I can actually set a breakpoint here. I can come back to my code, and then I'll say my username is Gantoka, Kevin Gantos put in my email address and then my password, and I'll make sure that they're the same, and I'll hit create. So I hit my breakpoint inside of my postback. My password has a value. My confirmed password also has a value. And then my two passwords are the same, so they match. So I'm going to go ahead and create my new user object. Create my context. Oh, and apparently I forgot a piece of my connection string. I forgot to include the provider name attribute. That's back in my web config. So we'll go ahead and stop. Jump back into my web config. Come down to my connection string. And then after the connection string, I'm going to do space, provider name, system.data.sql client. We'll come back and run again. Went ahead and just did the F5 so that it'll launch and set up for debug. Now I don't have a home controller, so I need to come back here, and I'll just reload my account create. And let's try that again. Alright. Everything worked great up to this point. So what I'm going to do this time is right click, and I'm going to say I'm going to click here, right click, and choose run to cursor. And that will allow the code to run up into that point. Then we'll step through, and then finally hit continue. So that brought us to our login action. And if we jump back here, and we'll open up and say show table data, we should be able to now see there's our user that we inserted into our users table. So we've now gone through the process of creating a users table. We've established that process for creating an account within our users table, and now the next step will be to actually authenticate our user using a login form.